What's the last thing you did that required effort? Well, for me, uh, Debbie and I just got back home on a about 1,200-mile car trip from rural southeast Kansas all the way back here to Las Vegas and home. It required effort. Now, I got cruise control, and we have a car that rides pretty well and is fairly quiet, and, have a radio. And so it wasn't like this was horrible, but there was effort involved. Okay. And more recently, after a night in my own bed, it took effort to get out of that bed and join the land of the living. Well, obviously, those are kind of frivolous. But there are things in life, you just can't get around it. There are things in life that require effort. And the Hebrew writer talks about two of them. Back in verse 14, this is chapter 12, verse 14, make every effort to live in peace with everyone. That requires effort. To live at peace, I can't make somebody else peaceful. I might contribute to their peace, but I don't get to make them any one way or the other. So it takes effort. It takes effort for me to think, to consider the other person, and to do what I can, the best I can, to understand them. Because if I'm going to live at peace with them, it's going to begin in two ways. One, with a request for God's help, because I'm not going to be able to do this on my own. And then I have to consider that person. I have to think about what they feel their needs to be and how they interpret life. And I don't have to read their mind. I just have to start considering them. Okay, live at peace. Make every effort. And that often means giving up this wackadoo idea that I often have. Everybody should be like me, for crying out loud. If they were, it'd be easy to live at peace. No. And then make every effort to live at peace with everyone. Now, there are ideas that I can never be at peace with. I wonder, though, can I be at peace with people that hold those ideas that I can't be at peace with? That's very difficult for me. And that's the big reason why it takes effort. But and I talked about this last time, make every effort to be at peace with everyone and to be holy. All right, let's make sure of I think, a quite important thing. We are made holy by God because of Christ's sacrifice and because of his grace. It's not my holiness, it's his holiness. But there's effort in me seeking to, I hate to use the word trying, and the reason is because it gets very distorted. What I want to do, and I think this is the sense in which the Hebrew writer would have meant it, I want to reflect the character and nature of Jesus. I want to be more and more like him all the time. So one of the things that will result out of that is holiness. But don't ever put effort toward holiness before the grace of Christ. So which is more important? Well, in my mind, the grace of Christ is, and that's where the power comes from for me to be able to make effort to be at peace with everyone and making effort to be holy. Can't do it on my own. It requires the power of God's grace. So that's kind of a tough deal. It's God's grace and my effort? Well, yeah, I think it's God's grace which gives me what I need in terms of emotional, spiritual, even physical power to make effort toward being like Jesus. You don't just wake up one day and go, oh, I'm like Jesus. No, doesn't work that way. You know that. Look at verse 15 now. See to it that no one falls short of the grace of God, and that no bitter root grows up to cause trouble and defile many. How do you fall short of the grace of God? Well, I know I have a tendency to make simple things complicated and complicated things too simple, but I'm going to try and think through this out loud with you. How does one fall short of God's grace? The only way I know, because you don't do anything to get God's grace. So it's not a matter of, weren't smart enough, weren't good enough, weren't devoted enough, didn't have enough faith, because none of that matters. Grace is about God, not me. My participation in God's grace is me embracing it, living by it, focusing on God's grace and how it empowers me. So one can fall short in that sense, that we begin to not contemplate, we begin to not think about, we kind of get preoccupied with things other than God's grace. And when that happens, we fall short of his grace. It's like we miss his grace, not because he withheld it, but because we somehow just factored it out. Or maybe the better way for me to say it is, we didn't organize our life around his grace. This is a hard thing, because I'll just share from my life, there are so many distractions from God's grace. There are things that happen in the world. There are tragedies. There are problems that fall into my lap, illnesses and all kinds of crummy stuff. And there's the good stuff. And sometimes I get so distracted by both the bad and the good, my life leaves the organization of it to itself, and instead of organizing itself around God's grace. That's how you fall short. Nobody can make me fall short, and The devil obviously will tempt me to fall short, but when I fall short, it's because I have lost sight of God's grace. So see to it that no one falls short of the grace of God. Okay, how do I see to it that no one does? I start with me, with the example of my life, how my life becomes a picture window for God's grace. I think about it, I talk about it, I share with the people in my life how God's grace and when God's grace uh, does for me what I can't do for myself. But there's a part of me that wants to see to it that you don't fall short of God's grace. And the best I can do is to admonish, caution, teach, and then reflect God's grace to you. I can't make you not fall short, but I can help you. So, okay, that's important for every believer, whether you ever think you're gonna be a teacher. Maybe you already are. Well, okay. Do what you can to help others not fall short of God's grace. And then he goes on, he says, and that no bitter root grows up to cause trouble and defile many. One of the things that happens when I lose track of God's grace, when I fail, when I'm not organizing my life around God's grace, is I don't know what to do with disappointment. When I take my eyes off of God's grace and I put my gaze strictly on what has disappointed me, then one of the things that's going to happen is what the writer calls a bitter root grows up. If we're not able to, if we don't remember to, if we don't make effort to focus on and stay grounded in God's grace, when disappointment comes, it's going to happen. Bitterness will grow. And bitterness, he says the root of bitterness, and here's why. Because when bitterness takes root in my life, there will be behaviors that are connected to my bitterness. And they cause trouble and defile many. When my life is organized around my disappointments and not God's grace, I have all kinds of trouble. I have trouble sustaining my effort in grace to follow Christ, to live my life meaningfully within his design. It causes me trouble. Well, what kinds of things result from bitterness? I think one of the big things is I become accusatory of myself and others and even God. David in the Psalms often said some pretty strong things to God, but his focus was not on his disappointment, but it was on the greatness, the goodness of God. I want to live there. Well, and one of the problems with bitterness is that it becomes defiling. It separates us from the God who loves us. So how do you make every effort to not fall short of God's grace so that no root of bitterness will grow up and we won't be defiled? It all goes back to God's grace, living in it, thinking about it, intentional thought, deep thought of God's grace. And then, and this is the hard part, we may have to come back to this, connecting on an emotional level with God's grace as well. Well, I've gone over time, so I'll close and I'll see you next time on Soul Care with Stevie Boy.